1:15, flag-waving Trump loyalists fill the steps and balconies. They even scale the walls.
I can see at least half a dozen protesters scaling, literally climbing the walls of the Capitol.
The thugs smash windows using fists and shields.
It is an absolutely shameful, disgusting situation that we are witnessing.
Everybody stay down! Inside the chamber, members of Congress take cover.
We were just told that there is a sincere gas in the rotunda, and we've been instructed to each of us get gas masks.
These are what the cases look like. They're kept under every chair in the event of a chemical attack. Police blocking the door as the
The challenge here at the Soul Trap has been twofold. Number one, I believe us, along with others, we're cutting edge when it comes to conspiracy theories. We have been, and we still are to some degree. One of the reasons why is because we believe that the Bible, the Word of God, specifically the King James edition of the text, gives us light unlike any other book or any other group or any other pursuit on the face of this earth. We've always been cutting edge, but one of the challenges that we've wrestled with is to know when the conspiracies are to be brought out and when we're actually living the conspiracies. We are that right now. In fact, one of the mottos here around the staff and around the Soul Trap lair is that we are living the conspiracies now. They're not in the shadows anymore. They're happening in broad daylight. But the second challenge that we have faced very often, and we face even now with certain things like Charlie Kirk's assassination and others, is how soon do we push the edge? How soon do we push the envelope? Getting into the questions, the warp and woof. How soon do we ask questions if there are legitimate questions to be asked? And how soon do we pursue the answers to those questions? In other words, sometimes you need to give people space to grieve or give space for truth to come out. But what happens if you go too long? The zeitgeist of the modern American mindset is changed rapidly from day to day, week to week, and within 2 to 3 to 4 months, an event as traumatic as Charlie Kirk's assassination or the Las Vegas shooting or the Nashville bombing or even the shooting that took place with the transgender at the Mass, well, those things just get faded into the background. So how soon do you push it? Well, the problem has always been that if you don't push it soon enough, we may lose an opportunity to gain insight and to gain truth. Of course, what we do with that truth is always the $64,000 question. Well, this is one of those examples where if you wait, then it gets pushed to the side, and then when the truth does come out, it's too late. Nothing can be done, nobody can be held responsible, and no change can really be affected in the mindset of the modern American group. Well, this is a situation that happened on January 6th. If you remember January 6th, that coup d'etat, as we were told, that insurrection took place. And on the night of January 6th, I believe we actually did here at the Soul Trap an interview with some people that were on the ground. And what we were told is that what we're being told is not the truth. There was more that was going on. It was not just an organic event that took place among insurrectionists, rebels, revolutionaries that wanted to burn the country down. In fact, they were being invited into the Capitol. In fact, we were actually told by people on the ground it was more than an invitation, more than they were allowing it to happen. It was as if it was being contrived, calculated, that it was actually being pushed and foisted upon the people there. Of course, the sad, tragic death of Ashley Babbitt still echoes in the minds of patriots who remember that day. So what exactly happened on January 6th? Well, as we pursued the truth, we were told to wait until the facts come out. Well, the facts did come out. Not 50 hours later or 56 weeks later, but 56 months later. We finally do have an answer. We finally do have revelations that what we thought, what we were told, what we were observing, and we felt was true, was actually true. Regardless of what you may think, or regardless of your opinion or what side of the aisle that you fall on, it is now crystal clear from the evidence that the United States government, or actors within, or rather agent provocateurs, were directly involved in inciting, directing, shaping, and using this event for their own nefarious ends. Joseph Heinemann and Steve Baker in an article write, FBI January 6 report sets off a firestorm. Why did it take 56 months to disclose that 274 agents were at the Capitol? President Donald J. Trump in the article goes on to state, wants the names and roles of each agent, while FBI Director Pash Patel says the agents only did crowd control. Now, whatever you think of Patel, I believe that that is either an outright lie that he is telling or an outright lie that he is continuing to perpetrate, because there was no crowd control. The article states the disclosure of 274 FBI special agents at the U.S. Capitol on January 6 has set off a firestorm of controversy, with Director Kash Patel insisting that the agents only did quote-unquote crowd control, while Donald J. Trump saying he wants to identify all the agents who he said were probably acting as agitators and insurrectionists. After 56 months of not disclosing the scope of the FBI's presence at the Capitol on January 6, a September 25th leaked report from the House Select Subcommittee to investigate the remaining questions surrounding January 6 has turned into an online free-for-all trying to assign blame and determine what the disclosure really means. Quote-unquote, one person said this was a mass entrapment scheme that was run and operated by the government. It was just revealed that the FBI had secretly placed against all rules, regulations, protocols, and standards, and one could argue the Constitution, 274 FBI agents in the crowd just prior to and during the January 6 hoax. President Trump wrote on Truth Social, "I want to know who each and every one of these so-called agents are and what they were up to on that now historic day." Let's take just a moment here and pause and go back and look at some of the video and some of the clips of that historic January 6th day.
And we're going to the Capitol. We'll stand in recess until the call of the chair.
We'll pause.
Protesters are in the building.
Thank you.
The House will be in order. Okay.
We are listening to Trump. Your boss. Treason! 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 Stop the steal! Stop the steal! Stop the
Now we know more than 365 FBI special agents and other staff from the Washington field office responded to the rapidly developing events at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, including 274 special agents, and get this, 89 intelligence analysts and support staff. Now my question is, who are the intelligence analysts? Is that CIA? Is that other field operatives from the FBI? Who are they? And the support staff, and what did they need to do to be there? And exactly what kind of crowd control were they doing? Remember, there is that double speak that we're so familiar with. Crowd control. Was it crowd control to keep them from the Capitol, or crowd control to get them into the Capitol? And let's not forget that some of the great actors that were so terrorizing were actually being led around by the police. Note the clips of the Buffalo Shaman actually being led around here in these videos by the police themselves.
Dangerous conspiracy theorist dressed in outlandish costume who led the violent insurrection to overthrow American democracy. For these crimes, Chansley was sentenced to nearly 4 years in prison, far more time than many violent criminals now receive. What did Jacob Chansley do to receive this punishment? To this day, there is dispute over how Chansley got into the Capitol building. But according to our review of the internal surveillance video, it is very clear what happened once he got inside. Virtually every moment of his time inside the Capitol was caught on tape. The tapes show that Capitol Police never stopped Jacob Chansley. They helped him. They acted as his tour guides. Here's video of Chansley in the Senate chamber. Capitol Police officers take him to multiple entrances and even try to open locked doors for him. We counted at least 9 officers who were within touching distance of unarmed Jacob Chansley. Not one of them even tried to slow him down. Chansley understood that Capitol Police were his allies. Video shows him giving thanks for them in a prayer on the floor of the Senate. Watch. Contrast the reality of what Jacob Chansley did in the Capitol building.
A report issued in December 2024 states that 26 FBI informants at the Capitol on January 6, including 4 others, actually went into the building. Now, Ron Paul writes in an article that he authored, "In my first column after the events of January 6, 2021, I criticized those who called the protest a coup, pointing out that some of the same politicians and bureaucrats denouncing the ridiculous farce at the Capitol, as if it were the equivalent of 9/11, have been involved for decades in planning and executing real coups overseas. In their real coups, many thousands of civilians have died. Cue up Venezuela."
You right to jail.
But that's another subject for another time. Paul writes, "The media at that time played up the violence committed by a relative few at the protest to stoking national outcry and demand for justice. More than 1,500 Americans were charged over the incident." Now that, my dear friends, is far more people that have been charged for burning down any of these cities like Portland, Missouri, all these other cities where you have the riots. Nobody ever seems to get charged there. But 1,500 of these were charged, and get this next number, it's staggering. 500 people were in prison, including outrageous prison sentences for relatively minor crimes like entering the Capitol building through doors opened by police and filming the event. While most Democrats and Republicans in Congress harshly denounced the January 6 quote-unquote insurrectionists, a few members displayed the appropriate skepticism over the accepted government narratives. Representative Thomas Massey, for example, was relentless in his search for answers to a simple but critically important question. How many of the insurrectionists were actually undercover FBI agents and law enforcement officers, and what role might they have played in inciting the violence? It's a legitimate question. We need to know. Massey grilled the then Attorney General Merrick Garland several times, but Garland would not budge. He refused to say whether there had been any undercover federal agents in the crowd, though of course he certainly knew. Last week we learned a little more of the truth. With the release of the FBI's long-lost quote-unquote after-action report, we now know more than 250-plus undercover agents were in the crowd. According to the report, they were given roles including crowd control that they were not suited for. Again, I believe that they were actually suited for the kind of crowd control they were implementing. Crowd control is a two-way street. We assume that crowd control meant keeping them from, but I don't believe that. I believe crowd control was inciting them to. Paul goes on to write, some agents cited in the report complained of political biases in the Bureau against conservatives. What other tasks might have been given to a politicized FBI undercover team? That's the question. In addition to the undercover agents, there were more than 24 paid informants in the January 6th crowd. Representative Barry Loudermilk of Georgia, who chairs the subcommittee investigating the matter, also asks an important question. Quote, with what many paid informants being in the crowd, we want to know how many were in the crowd, how many were in the building, but I also want to know, were they paid to inform or paid to instigate? That is a huge question that has yet to be answered. Paul writes in his article, were they paid to inform or paid to investigate? That's a good question. We do know that the events was used by the incoming Biden administration to demonize and persecute political opposition. There's no telling how many Americans would have liked to use the First Amendment guarantee of free speech to criticize the Biden administration, but were silenced by fear of persecution or worse. It's easy to conclude, seeing so many arrested and handed long sentences for nonviolent crimes, that it's better to keep quiet. At the time, the U.S. was still in the grip of COVID tyranny, where speaking out against the, quote, science would get you canceled, or even worse. This was another way to silence people who were not going along with the program. In the end, Paul writes, January 6, 2021 was in fact a coup of sorts. It was a coup against the First Amendment. The lesson for all of us is that we do not regularly but peacefully exercise our First Amendment guarantees. If we don't do that, then we will definitely lose them, regardless of who is in power. Now, let's remember that we were told these were violent insurrectionists, MAGA, crazed, bloodthirsty, MAGA supporters. But now come to find out, that's not true. The problem is we didn't find out about it until 56 months later. Do you think anybody's going to jail? Do you think anybody's going to be held accountable? That's the problem. None of these guys ever go to jail. Nobody ever gets arrested. Nobody ever does the perp walk. Nobody ever loses their pension. Nobody ever sits at a trial. And if it does, it's swept into the carpet, pushed aside, pushed away. And the system and the cycle goes on and on. It very, very much reminds us of something that was said in the book by Carol Quigley, Tragedy and Hope. Quigley talks about the fact that it really doesn't matter, and I'm paraphrasing, but it really doesn't matter whether it's Republican or Democrat. Because in the end, it just gives people the idea that they've quote-unquote kicked the bums out and now things are going to turn. It really is no longer an issue of right or left, but it is an issue of the elite and the non-elite. And that's why, though we can sometimes get our quote-unquote boy into the office, the real substantial, existential, systemic changes that we want to see take place, well, they never do take place. Because it's not a matter of right or left. It is a matter of the elite controlling the non-elite. January 6th proved that very clearly. And let's not forget something else that happened on January 6th. Let's go back and look at a few news reports, because it wasn't just the insurrection. Don't forget, it was the infamous pipe bombing.
We turn next tonight to news in the investigation after the deadly riots at the Capitol. Tonight, the FBI now increasing the reward for information about the suspect after those pipe bombs were found in D.C. the day of the siege. And tonight, also news of an arrest in the case of that officer crushed in that doorway. Here's our Chief Justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas, tonight.
Even as the arrests of those involved in the Capitol insurrection mount, one key suspect remains elusive. The person who planted those two pipe bombs at the nearby Democratic and Republican headquarters. Tonight, the FBI and ATF increasing the reward to $75,000 for any information about who's responsible. But as the hunt for the bomber continues, we're learning chilling details about other suspects arrested. Including authorities say this man, seen crushing D.C. police officer Daniel Hodges in that doorway. Patrick McCaughey of Connecticut, remaining in custody after being arrested following a tip to the FBI from a childhood friend. Also being held, William Calhoun, who allegedly bragged on social media about kicking down the door to Speaker Pelosi's office, part of an angry mob which he said would have torn her into pieces. In denying bail to Calhoun, who is an attorney, the judge described him as a threat, a man whose mind had been poisoned and who has no respect for the laws of the United States.
All right, so let's get right back to Pierre with us tonight as the FBI continues this investigation. Pierre, we also got news tonight on Director Christopher Wray at the FBI. It appears he's going to stay.
David, Chris Wray was under threat of being fired by Trump for months. The White House said today he's staying put, so he remains knee-deep in this massive Capitol Hill investigation, David.
All right, Pierre Thomas with us. Pierre.
All right, so let's go back and just jog our memory real quick, because again, 56 months is a lifetime. There were pipe bombs discovered January 6, 2021 in relation to the U.S. Capitol attack. They were found outside the Democratic National Committee and Republican National Committee headquarters in Washington, D.C. Here are key facts of what we do know, and I use that term facts and know very loosely. 2 pipe bombs were planted, quote unquote, remember this, the night before the Capitol riot, between 7:30 and 8:30 p.m. on January 5th. One bomb was placed near the RNC headquarters, the other near the DNC. The bombs were described as viable and capable of causing serious harm if detonated. They were detected and rendered safe on January 6th. Now, still what is unknown and what is supposedly still under investigation is who planted them. As of the latest reports, the suspect has not yet been identified. Federal authorities have released surveillance videos and descriptions, clothing, shoes, backpack, etc., and are offering reward. Of course, the motivation is definitely known. It's not definitely known whether the bombs were meant as a diversion, a threat, or to scare people or something else. Some law enforcement officials believe the devices may have been intended to divert responders away from the Capitol during the riot. So the pipe bombs are believed to have been real. They were planted there in some deep, thought-out plot to draw attention away from the Capitol. There were going to be a riot. Nobody knows what was going to happen at the riot, but nonetheless, there we are. We've all forgotten about the pipe bombs, but we haven't. What if they mean something? What if there's truth? What if there's something more that we need to learn from them? Well, there are bizarre new facts that have come out about the January 6th pipe bombs. In an article from Blaze staff, Representative Barry Loudermilk says new evidence shatters the Biden-era narrative on the January 6th pipe bombs, revealing suspicious timing and missing cell data. Now again, let's pause for a minute. Unless we get upset, let's remember that this was 56 months ago. This happened January 6th, 2021. It is now 2025. Who cares? Nobody seems to care. These articles even themselves to me are almost kind of laughable. Everybody's upset. The internet's ablaze. No, it's not. Nobody cares. Nobody's going to jail. It's almost as if it is the ancient Roman Republic, who now no longer needs to feel concerned about coming up with legitimacy, with a conspiracy to hide a conspiracy. They just do what they want in the open. And that is exactly what is happening. The article goes on to say, curious new facts have come to light in the January 6th pipe bomb case. Representative Barry Loudermilk isn't buying a previous narrative that the Biden administration pushed. Quote, it's amazing what having an administration that actually wants to get the truth can do to change the narrative. Loudermilk tells Blaze Media co-founder Glenn Beck on the Glenn Beck program, noting that the original premise was that the pipe bombs were placed on the evening of January 5th. Problem is, that leaves one huge inconsistency. I reached out to the FBI several times during that time period. Of course, the Biden administration, they were not forthcoming with information. Basically, they always use this excuse, quote unquote, it's an ongoing investigation, so we can't share that information. Of course, that right now is what we're hearing about Charlie Kirk. exactly what happened here, when did this happen, where was he found, how was the gun put together, etc., etc., etc. And the excuse that we're giving is it's an ongoing investigation. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand that. If you're putting a case together and you're trying to do things decently and in order, we have to do that. But the problem is they're able to obfuscate. They're able to get away by time being their friend and being the truth's enemy. Because the truth only matters when it matters to the people that it's being told to. And time has a way of making these truths not matter to the American people. Loudermilk goes on to say, so what we've learned through the Trump administration is that the story doesn't fit with the facts that we're finding. It appears to us that the pipe bombs had a 60-minute egg timer on them. Now, why is that important to understand? Well, the fact of the matter is, if you put a 60-minute egg timer on a bomb that you want to go off and put it there exactly 24 hours away from the time that it's supposed to go off, I don't know about you, but I don't know many egg timers that you can set for 24 hours. An egg timer is set for maybe an hour, maybe less. In other words, why would you plant the bomb 24 hours before it's supposed to go off and you only have a 1-hour timer on it? Loudermilk goes on to state, January 6th, the United States Capitol building was supposedly attacked by a mob of supporters from President Donald Trump in an attempted coup 2 months after his 2020 presidential defeat. But there were egregious security failures. Attempts to catch the January 6 pipe bombers, the House reports, failed. Loudermilk recalls receiving a lab report from the FBI on the pipe bombs that said there was no electric timer, as we previously stated. The only timer was a quote-unquote 60-minute egg timer, so it's impossible that these pipe bombs were placed and armed on the night of January 5th. They had to be placed at some point not long before they were found on January 6th, he tells Glenn Beck. A woman who discovered the pipe bomb was placed near the Republican National Committee headquarters, claims there were still 20 minutes left on the egg timer when she found it. I'll let that sink in. The woman who found it said she saw that there was still 20 minutes left on the egg timer. That is an inconsistency. But that's not the only inconsistency, Loudermilk states. The other is mysterious data, or data that has, quote, mysteriously disappeared. And it was when the FBI was doing its geofence searches. They went to all the major cell carriers and asked for the precise data of people who were in that area January 5th and 6th. The only cell carrier that didn't provide information was AT&T. AT&T apparently corrupted the data. Now, we kept hearing that the data was corrupted, and this is my previous investigation. Loudermilk states, AT&T claimed they didn't corrupt the data, the FBI did. The FBI, we found out later, said no, the data was corrupted when we got it. Now that we get the real information, it becomes even more mysterious. Who was it who corrupted the data? Was it AT&T? Was it FBI? Or was it a collaboration? This is where the entity known as FirstNet comes in, which was created by Congress after 9/11 to preempt cell service for law enforcement. So FirstNet actually sits on the AT&T backbone. For some reason, and this is where my suspicions started growing, is when the FBI contacted AT&T, gave them a preservation letter, save all this data specifically around the areas where the pipe bombs were, because they have to go through the legal mumbo-jumbo to actually get the subpoena, he explains. So they don't want stuff to disappear. They send a letter telling AT&T to preserve the data. AT&T responds and says you have to go to FirstNet to get this data, which raises my suspicions. Why are they telling them to go to the carrier just for law enforcement? In other words, something isn't jiving. People are not communicating. There's a lot of misty, murky things going on as if nobody wants this data coming forth. According to FirstNet, that data was going to be deleted within just a few hours. So they were in a massive hurry to download all the data before it was deleted, and somehow it just got corrupted. Nobody, Loudermilk says, is buying the story. When they went into further research, they found that Capitol Police diverted the CCTV cameras away from the DNC pipe bomb investigation, except for one. In an article dated February 13th, 2024, they found that one camera that the Capitol Police forgot about. All the others were diverted. Among the most enduring unsolved mysteries surrounding the events at the U.S. Capitol on January 6 are pipe bombs planted outside the offices of the Republican and Democratic National Committee. In January, Blaze News revealed that the individual who discovered the device outside the DNC offices was described by the FBI as a quote, passerby, but was in fact a plainclothes U.S. Capitol police officer. Isn't it interesting how these plainclothes guys show up? Plainclothes FBI, plainclothes intelligence officers, plainclothes informants, and then who discovered the DNC? A plainclothes U.S. Capitol officer. Now, after reviewing hours of closed-circuit TV footage, and if you've ever been to Washington, you know for every 2 feet there is a video camera. You can't get anywhere and not see something, which, for lack of time, I don't want to digress, is why I find it very hard to believe that a jetliner can hit the Pentagon and nobody can get a clear picture of it. But I digress. The article goes on to state, after receiving hours of closed-circuit TV footage, Blaze News can report that 2 or 3 U.S. Capitol Police surveillance cameras pointed at the DNC office building were actually redirected away from the scene shortly after the device was discovered. As part of our investigation, I requested and received access to this footage from Larry Loudermilk and his staff. Blaze News is still trying to get the information and find out why these cameras were diverted. The DNC pipe bomb case is of special interest because Kamala Harris
You think you just fell out of a coconut tree?
was in the building when the device was discovered. Harris, a former U.S. Senator from California, was Vice President-elect and under Secret Service protection at the time, but that's not a big deal. Who cares?
Well, some people have actually said I was the most qualified candidate ever to run for president. I'm just speaking fact. Yeah.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I've ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. God have mercy on your soul.
More than 3 years later, federal investigators have not uncovered the origin of the alleged pipe bombs. The FBI has not identified a suspect in either the RNC or in the DNC pipe bomb incident, and a $500,000 reward remains in effect for information leading to the arrest of the would-be bomber. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Why do we not trust whatever the government says? Why do we not take things at face value? Or could it be because 56 months later, 1,500 arrests later, 500 incarcerations later, people being traumatized, demonized, free speech being limited, could it be that we were right all along? That night, the voices that were claiming that this was not a coup, but a conspiracy. The voices that were claiming that this was not something that happened organically, but that it was astroturf. It was managed. It was manufactured out of thin air. Could it be that the death of Ashley Babbitt and the pictures that we saw and the reality that we saw was a carefully crafted hoax, not by left and not by right, but by the elite, to further perpetrate the nefarious ends that they want? Could it be that what we saw was true? The answer is yes. But we didn't get confirmation of that truth for 56 months. So you have to ask yourself now, when it comes to Charlie Kirk, when it comes to Venezuela, when it comes to Hamas and Israel, when it comes to October 7th, and how that Israel, the most offended country in all the world, can go for an hour while a bunch of yahoos and hang gliders wreak havoc on their country. How did that happen? When you begin to ask these questions, we have to come to the conclusion that it really is no longer a conspiracy. It is out in the open. And who cares? We may release it to you, we may not. But when we do let the truth go, you'll know the truth, but it will be long after the nation is interested in the truth. January 6th, pipe bombs. The truth has finally come out. The problem is, nobody's listening.
I think you all know that I've always felt the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
FBI has straight up admitted that they now had hundreds, close to 300 undercover FBI agents in the crowd on January 6th.